Immigration is right back at the top of the political agenda in Britain and across the West. We're seeing incredibly high levels with 1.2 million people arriving in Britain legally last year as workers or as students who are definitely here to study and not just using it as a Trojan horse to get into Britain, and the dependence of all these workers and students, because if there's one thing we don't have enough of in Britain, it's people who are dependent. Alongside the legal migration, there's highly visible illegal immigration on small boats. Man, I bet Rishi wished they still came in hidden in trucks instead of sitting high on inflatable rafts where everyone can see exactly who's seeking refuge from the war-torn hell of Calais. I mean, if we're going to talk about cultural differences, apparently in some cultures, the women and children stay behind in the war zone to fight. Concern about immigration fell in the wake of Brexit as people thought that they'd voted to control their borders, but it's now rising again as people realise that they'd actually voted to completely lose control of their borders. And all of this is having a huge impact on politics. We've got Reform, a party who want to actually control immigration, overtaking the Tories in the polls. And it's increasingly obvious to everyone that Britain's creaking asylum system was built for a different time, before cheap mass travel and before social media beamed back videos of happy migrants counting cash in hotels, and is now being gamed by people who pretend to be gay or Christian so that they can be sent back, all with the help of politically correct vicars and human rights lawyers who've had decades to work out every loophole in a well-meaning but gullible set of rules meant to help genuine refugees. And the situation isn't helped by a systemically woke civil service that's so ideologically committed to open borders that it undermines democracy by refusing to enact the will of the government elected on a promise of controlling borders. And anyone like me who questions mass migration is condemned as a far-right racist, which is ridiculous and is, to be honest, getting a bit boring now. We're not hateful bigots. I'm basically a 90s lefty who stayed in the same place while the whole world went full-on transgender chairman Mao Cuban bananas. The old left was actually against open borders because they knew the effect it would have on wages and living standards for British workers. People like me have got no problem with the free flow of people across Europe. We're concerned about people coming from radically different cultures who don't integrate and, worse, want to change Britain to be like the repressive, impoverished countries they've come from. And we're concerned about mass migration creating a backlash that will affect the immigrants who are our friends, families and colleagues. We've seen the lessons of demographic change in history, from the Roman Empire to Lebanon to the Balkans. We're not bigots, we're trying to stop a hellish and inevitable civil war in the future. And why shouldn't people have some claim to the land that they were born on, the land that their ancestors tilled? You wouldn't go to an Amazonian tribe protesting against oil prospectors and accuse them of xenophobia, even though those oil companies are bringing civilization, PlayStations, pornography and social media, all the things that make modern life wonderful. Economists say that we need migration to sustain the Ponzi scheme that is our economy and to offset population decline, because one thing that I've noticed in London is the lack of people, and it's way too easy to find a parking space. The whole thing is a complete clown show, and this is why the Economist's lead article for 2024, their main topic for the year, is on immigration and how the establishment can detoxify it. I know we hear that the establishment is out of touch, but this article really demonstrates it. Now, I like The Economist, I'm a subscriber. It used to be a very pragmatic, informed publication advocating the best good for the most people, but now, like every institution, it's drifted to the left. It's hugely influential though, so it gives an insight into the thinking of governments who are steered by left-wing special interest groups, NGOs, and most importantly, economists. Because for any government, the economy is the most important thing. Basically, economists see Britain not as a country of people with shared history and values, but as a banal economic platform which anyone in the world should be free to enter as they please, because people are just interchangeable GDP-generating nodes. So immigration makes a line on a graph go up, which is a good thing, regardless of the impact on lines on other graphs that measure things like GDP per person, or house prices, or crime, or female genital mutilation. And immigration is the topic where left-wing idealism and cold hard capitalist greed and political concerns about population decline converged to push for open borders. Anyway, let's have a look at this article. Every day, screens around the world fill with grim pictures from Gaza, where nearly 2 million Palestinians have been forced out of their homes. Even larger numbers have been displaced in Congo, Sudan, Syria and Ukraine. Most people feel compassion when they see fellow humans fleeing from bombs, bullets or machetes, but many also experience another emotion: fear. Seen through a screen, the world can seem violent and scary, even to residents of safe, rich places. Many worry that ever-swelling numbers of refugees and other migrants will surge across their borders. Nativist politicians talk of an invasion. Fear has curdled rich world politics. A man who once advocated banning the Quran could be the next Dutch Prime Minister. Britain's Conservative Party is trampling on constitutional norms to try and send asylum seekers on a one-way trip to Rwanda. Donald Trump tells hollering crowds that unlawful immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. Geert Wilders, the potential Dutch Prime Minister they referenced there, doesn't seem like a man motivated by fear, to be honest. In fact, given that so many people who are critical of Islam, like his fellow Dutchmen Pim Fortuyn and Theo van Gogh, end up assassinated, Wilders seems to have balls of steel. It's the leftists who toady to fundamentalist Islam in the hope that it'll fight the right wing for them, who are yellow-bellied, particularly as they're hoping that if they're nice to the crocodile, it won't eat them. Sadly, the history of leftists allying with radical Islam in places like Iran suggests that it's not a fast track to some sort of leftist utopia. In Tehran, the leftists who helped the Ayatollah into power are still waiting for their state-funded queer poetry collectives to be set up. And The Economist talks about the Conservative Party trampling on constitutional norms. Well, these constitutional norms aren't always good. It's a constitutional norm for the civil service to deny the will of the people and their elected officials by blocking any attempt to control our borders, such as using the Rwanda plan. This is wrong and dangerous because if voters aren't listened to, they'll lose faith in democracy. Voters have seen the elevation of experts and special advisors over themselves. Britain is a kind of technocratic dictatorship, and this idea that any questioning of mass immigration is motivated by fear is wrong. It's not fear, it's concern. Some people are coming here from medieval cultures with deeply different attitudes, for example to women or gays, and these cultural differences don't evaporate when people step off the boats onto British soil. And there's no recognition of the impact of rapid demographic change, despite history being littered with warnings, from the Goths being invited into Rome and then depressing everyone with their gloomy electro music, to Lebanon allowing in Palestinian refugees, which turned out to be enormously enriching, but for local glazers and funeral homes. Mass migration can destabilise a country, which is why Putin uses migration as a weapon against Europe, literally flying migrants from North Africa to Russia and Belarus, and then busing them to the border with Europe to precipitate a migrant crisis. Maybe Putin doesn't know about the scientific equation that says that diversity equals strength, so every load of migrants he sends over into Europe just makes Europe stronger. The establishment assumes that experts know more than us dumb schmoes who actually cast votes, but in reality, anyone motivated to join a special interest group and become one of these self-appointed experts is going to be an ideologue with radical ideas. Just look at how Scotland's politicians allowed activist groups pushing radical gender ideology to convince them that what Scotland needs is gender self-ID rules that allow male rapists to be sent to women's prisons. The experts got that one very wrong, and the system of non-governmental organisations, or NGOs, subverts democracy. NGOs are activist groups that have huge influence because of the overly cosy relationships they have with the governments they orbit and are supported by. In Ireland, for example, the government spends 8% of its budget on NGOs, a huge amount of money, who then lobby the government with the opinions the government likes. The government can then say, hey look, we're responding to public demand, when in fact they're responding to NGOs who've been paid to tell the government what they want to hear. Some perspective is in order. The vast majority of people who migrate do so voluntarily and without drama. For all the talk of record numbers and unprecedented crisis, the share of the world's people who live outside the country of their birth is just 3.6%. It has barely changed since 1960, when it was 3.1%. These statistics are disingenuous. In Sweden, the proportion of foreign-born individuals was 4% in 1960. By 2022, 27% of the population had a foreign background. That's a huge increase, and using foreign-born or foreign background as an identifier fails to account for the ethnic and cultural background. Someone with a similar background, for example from Norway, is going to have a completely different impact on Swedish society than someone who's arrived from Eritrea. It also doesn't take into account the overrepresentation of young men as immigrants, or for the fact that second and third generation migrants are not counted as foreign-born. born, even though in some cases they can remain culturally distant. Sometimes second and third generation migrants can be more entrenched in their home culture as they ghettoise and cling to their identity. The notion that refugees pose a serious threat to rich countries is also far-fetched. Most fugitives from danger do not go far. Of the 110 million people whom the UN classified as forcibly displaced as of mid-2023, more than half remained in their own countries. Barely 10% had made it to the rich world, slightly more than the population of London. This is not a trivial number, but it is plainly manageable if governments cooperate. Overall, poorer countries host 9 times more displaced people with skimpier resources and less hysteria. Yeah, poor countries take in more refugees, but it makes sense for people to seek refuge in countries near their own. They'll be culturally similar and easier to integrate with, and it's easier to return when peace is restored. I mean, that's assuming they are actually moving because of war. If France was invaded, which probably will happen thanks to the West's dithering over Putin's aggression, I'm sure Britain would happily take in huge numbers of French people. There's less hysteria in the poorer countries because they're generally closer in culture, and also they don't lavish state aid on refugees, putting them up in 5-star hotels and elevating diversity over their home culture. Interestingly, places that have successfully handled incredibly high levels of immigration, such as Dubai, make a point of elevating home culture over that of immigrants, instead of reveling in the cultural self-loathing that's so fashionable in the West. And as for the threat to rich countries, when I worked in criminal intelligence in a deprived London borough, we had an influx of young male refugees from Somalia who'd been exposed to horrific levels of violence, and they brought that violence with them. So we started seeing far more extreme levels of violence used by gangs. The populist right drums up fears of overwhelming numbers in order to win votes. I love how the establishment uses populist as a slur. How dare a politician do what's popular with the people? How vulgar! Everyone knows that politics should be imposed on the plebs by experts who know better than them. And I don't know anyone on the right who plays on fears to win votes. Everyone I know who's critical of immigration seems to have a genuine, heartfelt concern for how immigration might change our country. Not only the demographics, but the culture, the values, and the institutions that support our rights and our prosperity. You only need to look at the countries that asylum seekers are coming from to see how certain cultures don't give rise to healthy, free, tolerant, prosperous societies. And it's extremely naive to blithely import these cultures and just go, well, fingers crossed, it all works out somehow. Far from the right being the people cynically pretending to take a populist position to win votes, the socialist left, like Labour and the SNP, take populist positions of promising to redistribute wealth from successful, hard-working people to lazy dolies, even though history has shown that hardcore socialism is terrible for countries. And although right-wing politicians get accused of being populist to get elected, nobody criticises left-wing politicians for supporting high levels of immigration because they think that the immigrants will vote for them. Tony Blair's government openly admitted that they wanted open borders to rub the right's nose in it. If voters won't vote the way the left wants, the left brings in people who will. It doesn't seem to be that democratic to me. Some on the left inflame the issue in different ways. Lavishing benefits on asylum seekers while making it hard for them to work guarantees that they will be a burden, which is why Sweden's anti-immigrant party now has a slice of power. This is misleading. I believe that since 2014, asylum seekers in Sweden have been allowed to work during their application process, but there's still a huge gulf in employment rates compared to those born in Sweden. The reason Sweden's anti-immigrant party is a slice of power is that Sweden saw incredibly high levels of immigration, the highest per capita in Europe, and the consequences haven't been the best advert for open borders. Sweden's famously high-trust, cohesive society has been rocked by a surge in violence and sexual offences. Idealistic Swedish politicians who demanded that refugees be allowed to settle are now changing their minds. Everyone's an idealistic liberal until they get mugged by reality. Calling for the abolition of border controls, as some American radicals do, terrifies the median voter. Insisting that everyone should be defined by race and given a pecking order with the majority group ranked last, and then demanding that America admit millions more members of minority groups is a recipe for ensuring Mr. Trump's re-election. I agree with this bit. Leftists who demand open borders are sowing the seeds of their own downfall, because it's just not something that regular voters are going to go for. And the Western trend for elevating minorities above indigenous populations isn't going to make people happier earlier about bringing in more immigrants. A wiser approach to migration would bear in mind two things. First, moving tends to make people much better off than they would have been had they stayed put. Those who flee from danger find safety. Those who seek a new start find opportunity. Migrants from poor countries to rich ones vastly raise their own wages and have little to no effect on those of the native born. Mobility also allows families to spread risks. Many pool cash to send a relative to a city or to a richer country, so they have at least one income that doesn't depend on the local weather. Migrants having little to no effect on native wages? The Economist thinks the labour market doesn't function as a market. Maybe The Economist should be renamed The Idealist. The no impact on native wages argument is a narrative that's pushed, even though logically it doesn't make sense. If you increase the supply of labour in the market, the price will drop. That's just how markets work. And not only does it not make logical sense, the data shows that it isn't true. Look at how the salaries of truckers increased when Brexit reduced the number of overseas truckers in the UK, or how curry chef salaries increased when immigration restrictions affected their businesses. Now, I'm not saying the economic stimulus from immigration doesn't exist, but the economic stimulus and the benefit tends to go to rich people who get cheap labour for their businesses, cheaper nannies for their annoying kids, cheaper extensions on their already massive houses. The economic negatives tend to fall on the working class, who have competition for jobs and school places and doctors and housing, and working class incomes go down as their costs go up and living standards fall. When I worked as a labourer, I worked alongside guys from Eastern Europe who are living 3 to a room. How is a native Brit who's got a mortgage, a car to run, a family to feed, going to be able to compete with them for wages? Recipient countries can benefit from immigration, especially if they manage it well. The most desirable destinations can attract the world's most talented and enterprising people. Immigrants in America are nearly twice as likely to start a company as the native born, and 4 times likelier to win a Nobel Science Prize. Less skilled migrants fill gaps in ageing labour forces and free up locals for more productive tasks. For example, when a foreign nanny enables 2 parents to work full time. Yeah, was it Hillary Clinton who said that the migrants streaming across the American border were future doctors and scientists? Looking at the boats coming across the channel, I'm not sensing a great need for Nobel Prize polish. I get the feeling that previous waves of immigration, such as the Windrush migrants from the Caribbean or Ugandan Asians who brought us Suella's parents, integrated better and held our country in higher regard. They really wanted to be British, and they are British. My uncle's Indian, and he loves this country more than I do. And the economic arguments for open borders have been debunked. The Migration Advisory Committee report in 2023 revealed that the high number of dependents coming in meant that care workers were likely to impose a net fiscal cost on the Treasury. You might get some staff who'll work for cheap, but they bring families who require housing, health, education, etc. And also, arguments for immigration are predicated on the fact that we're poaching the best and brightest from overseas. We're not. We're getting the people who can't be bothered trying to get into America. We're getting anyone who just rocks up in a boat. 75% of Somalians in the UK are dependent on benefits. We're told our economy is a Ponzi pyramid scheme and we need to bring people in at the bottom to support the unemployed and retiring Brits at the top. But we're bringing people in at the top who need to be supported. We can't even get a basic Ponzi scheme right. Should we really be poaching the best and brightest from the developing world? Do poor African countries have such an excess of trained doctors that they have plenty to share with the UK? It seems a bit unfair for Zimbabwe to spend its scarce resources training up doctors, and then as soon as they're trained, we just steal them. Also, this line that recipient countries can benefit from immigration, especially if they manage it well, seems to be a tacit admission that recipient countries often do not benefit from immigration. A more mobile planet would be richer. By one estimate, completely free movement would double global GDP. These colossal gains remain unrealised because they would accrue mostly to the migrants who cannot vote in the countries they want to move to. Still, rather than leaving all these trillions of dollars on the floor, wise governments should find ways to share some of them. That means persuading voters that migration can be orderly and legal, and proving that immigrants not only pay their way, but enhance the collective good. This is very revealing. An economist who just sees a country as numbers on a sheet thinks that completely open borders would be great because it would increase GDP for governments. Mass migration good because line on graph go up. But GDP per capita would go down. Indeed, it has gone down. And what use is money when you can't buy what you need with it? People want housing, food, services. All of these wouldn't just soar in price, they'd be logistically unavailable. It doesn't matter how much GDP there is, God isn't making any more land, and a field can only grow so many potatoes. Economists see the perfect Western city as a densely populated shantytown crammed with people to an insane extent, far more rammed than even the slums of Calcutta, even though this would destroy any notion of a high-trust society and the values that allow a country to become pleasant and prosperous in the first place. Demographics is destiny. So border security should be tight while the slow process of denying or granting entry is streamlined. A realistic number of workers should be admitted and selected primarily by market forces such as visa auctions. Immigrants should be free to work and pay taxes, but not to draw the same welfare benefits as citizens, at least for a while. I actually agree with all of this, especially the visa auctions. I don't know why that isn't just the standard way of getting into the country for economic migrants. Someday, the creaking global asylum system should be modernised and the task of offering sanctuary should be shared more fairly. A provisional EU deal announced on December the 20th is a small step in the right direction. I agree that the asylum system needs to be modernised, but is it fair to force countries to take in people from incompatible cultures? Pessimists on the right argue that more migration will breed disorder since people from alien cultures will not assimilate, yet studies find no solid evidence that diverse countries are less stable. Contrast homogeneous Somalia with many-hued Australia. I can't tell if they're taking the piss. When we say homogeneous, we mean culture, not skin colour. Somalia isn't homogeneous anyway, it's a multi-ethnic clan-based society. The article is being pretty racist in assuming that homogeneity of skin colour is the be-all and end-all. Culture and values are far more important. I have much more in common with Kemi and Suella than I do with Owen Jones, even though Owen and I have similar levels of melanin. Australia takes a robust approach to border control, selecting a higher quality of migrant than just taking anyone who turns up, and is more robust in encouraging integration as it has more national pride than Britain, which, to be honest, sees national pride as a deplorable trait. So of course, Australian immigration is more successful. Pessimists on the left say that the West will never let in many people or treat newcomers fairly because it is incorrigibly racist. Yet though racism persists, it has dwindled more than many people realise. When Barack Obama was born, mixed-race marriages were illegal in much of America, and many Brits still thought they had a right and a duty to rule other nations. Now, a fifth of new American marriages are mixed, and Brits find it unremarkable that a descendant of colonial subjects is their Prime Minister. British Indians, Chinese Canadians, and Nigerian Americans all earn more than their white compatriots, suggesting racism is not the main determinant in their life chances. I agree with this, it makes some great points. The West is far more tolerant and open than the left's myth of systemic racism, and this is shown in the success that many immigrant communities have had. In the future, climate change may spur people to move more, but this will be gradual, and two forces of the opposite effect, the shift from farms to cities, a much bigger mass movement than cross-border migration, will slow as most of the world is already urban, and humanity will grow less mobile as it ages. Today, rich countries have a wonderful opportunity to import youth, brains and dynamism. It may not last forever. Yeah, what an amazing opportunity. The economic argument for mass immigration is the same argument that economists made for slavery when abolition was proposed. Really what the economy needs is automation, so self-driving cars and robots in farms and factories to take the menial jobs out of the hands of people so we don't need a constant flow of migrants to sustain our economy. But there's no incentive for businesses to invest in automation when cheap labour is available. And we're told that mass migration is necessary because people in the West aren't having enough kids. But the main reason people put off having kids is that they can't afford a home to raise them in. And the reason homes are unaffordable is that we keep importing more people than we have homes for. What's wrong with a decline in population anyway? More space and resources per person, lower carbon emissions? I thought these were the things that the left wanted. Call me old-fashioned, but I still think the main entry route into this country should be through birth canals rather than across the English Channel. Anyway, I just wanted to show how experts can get things wrong and how dangerous it is for the will of the people to be subverted in favour of these experts. Most experts aren't experts anyway, they're just activists masquerading as experts. Experts often get things completely wrong, like when European politicians openly laughed at Trump when he suggested that a reliance on Russian oil and gas left Europe vulnerable. Trump was proven completely right when Putin invaded Ukraine and used energy as a weapon to freeze Europe into dropping support for Ukraine. Experts are sometimes studying the trees too closely to see the wood, and people in power or positions of influence have the bias of their own personal experiences. I was discussing the lack of integration in some migrant communities with a left-wing commentator who blithely dismissed the issue, saying, well, I knew lots of immigrants when I was doing a master's at LSE and they were all integrating perfectly. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the wealthy kids doing masters at elite universities who are living in parallel communities or taking part in grooming gangs. Sometimes I think these issues will only be taken seriously when they start affecting our ruling classes, when grooming gangs target girls in boarding schools instead of care homes, and their establishment is beholden to economists who see the country not as interconnected communities with a shared heritage, but as numbers on a balance sheet. They prioritise the economy, not the people. They say, are there enough people for the jobs, rather than, are there enough jobs for the people? What happens if some of these jobs don't get done? So strawberries become more expensive, or we have to walk down and collect our own pizza, or some old people have to wipe their own bums. Maybe that's an acceptable trade-off for a cohesive, high-trust, sustainable society. Anyway, thanks for listening. And if you want to support me making these videos and get early access and exclusive content, you can join my community of like-minded souls on Patreon. And please share this video with a left-wing friend so you can show them that people who want border control aren't foaming-mouthed reactionaries. We're just sensible. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll be Leo Kears. Bye. Bye bye.